and education has always been centered in my world. I'm gonna throw some pictures up there. My first connection to education is with my mom. I'm the daughter of a history teacher, and I said since I was able to talk that I was not going to be a teacher. That was not my calling, Mama. It's not what I want to do with my life. And she always said, "You're going to be a teacher. You're going to be a teacher." I'm just like, "Okay, yeah, sure." And really, what happened is a lot of times as a kid growing up, usually dinner table conversations might talk about cartoons and sports, and I loved Barbies. I talked about Barbies at the table at dinner time. But we also talked about the Reconstruction era, Civil Rights Movement. We talked about Harlem Renaissance. We talked about World Wars. We talked about all kinds of things. And I was 8 years old when I learned the preamble. It's not because I was a baby genius. That's not it. That's not it. It is because that is just what my household was like. We just talked about history all the time. It was more than a subject that I studied in school. It really was a part of my life. So that is one connection that I have to the world of education and history. Another connection that I have, as I've mentioned, I'm a Knoxville educator. This is an image from a WATE story with my students. Oh goodness, this has been 7 years ago, I think. So the young lady sitting right there is probably about 23 years old at this point. We were in the midst of a major turnaround and really helping our school come to be what we always knew it would be. When I joined Vine Middle School as an 8th grade science teacher back in 2015, my students and I did amazing things. We won an experiment contest. We were able to send our experiment to outer space. It was tested by scientists, and those students got to know what it feels like to actually be called a scientist, and that was a beautiful time. So that's another huge connection that I have to education, and that's why also it's so important for me as an educator to make sure I really understand the history of the community and what my students, their families, their ancestors have experienced in the city if I really want to be impactful in their lives. And then thirdly, I am connected to education, the education world, because I'm a mother. I have 2 daughters in the far right over there, Madison and Maya. They are 11 and 11, right? Yeah, she just turned 11. I'm still like, what's, okay. 11, doesn't sound right. And 13, they are in 5th and 8th grade. So we're about to move to a new world, right? I'm trying to brace myself for it. But like many parents and grandparents and community aunts and community uncles, we care so deeply about our youth, and I care so deeply about the experiences that my girls have in school. In fact, I care so much that I wrote a book. And it came out last year, and it's about how educators can better support and protect the experiences of Black girls during the middle school years. Middle school is a time when they're already trying to navigate the intersection of identity and belonging and confidence and finding their voice and advocating for themselves, but still feeling like little girls. And at the same time, they're smudged right in the middle of racial bias and gender bias. So navigating all of those things at the same time is really difficult. Sometimes behaviors rise up that we might say, oh, like, why is this 12-year-old acting like this? Well, there's a lot underneath that we have to unpack. And so I put that all in a book that I released last year. So when I talk about women, when I say women, education, and hope, and I'm thinking about all those things, I'm thinking about it not just from the lens of a person who really does enjoy history, but also from the lens of a daughter, as an educator, and as a mother. I think about it from all those lenses. So going forward and thinking about Knoxville, I grabbed a couple of images of what early Knoxville was like, and this was around between 17 and 1800s, going into the 1800s of what we see on the far right, and then these images here are around the mid-1800s. When we talk about the history of cities, we often focus on those big moments, right? We think about, honestly, we think about wars. We think about what kind of battles happened, what kind of conquest might have taken place. We think about political leaders that rose and fell during those times. We think about the economic turning points when we think about history. But we also have to pause and think about education. And it's rare that education grows through dramatic events. Now, we have had some events that has caused education to grow, The one that pops into my mind first is Brown versus Board of Education. That was a huge event, right? That really catapulted education in a different space. But education was happening well before Brown versus Board of Education. It was happening well before we were having conversations about how to make education better. We were just trying to figure out how do we do it. And so when we think about education within Knoxville, there was really a quiet persistence that was beginning to take shape and take form, and that was growing. And all throughout Knoxville's history, many of the people that carried that quiet persistence with educational growth were women. Some were teachers, some were community leaders, some were mothers who simply believed that their children deserved opportunities that they themselves had never been given. Many of them worked without titles. They went without recognition. Their names weren't always in textbooks, and still are not. We might not ever know their names, but we know that their influence shaped generations, because we're all sitting here and we're all product of the generations that were shaped from that. So tonight I want to share the stories of 4 women. There's so many that we could talk about, but I zoomed in on 4, and I want to talk about their lives and help us to understand how education became a source of hope in Knoxville during many different seasons when it felt like hope was lost. Education was still right there under the foundation of the movements. As we reflect on their stories tonight, during Women's History Month, something that really does became clear to me as I was thinking and researching for this, is that the work of these women is still unfolding today. It has truly not stopped, and we're going to talk about that. And I'll show you why I say that. And in their lives, when I was really looking at these 4 women and thinking about, what stories are we going to talk about tonight, and what can we learn from what they did, there are 4 truths that I picked out. So the first truth is that education began here in Knoxville as an act of freedom. I'm from Jackson, Tennessee, right? That truth can apply to Jackson, Tennessee. It can apply to Chattanooga, Tennessee, where my husband is from. It can apply to anywhere that we can imagine. But that was something that really popped out to me quickly as I was thinking about, what can we learn from these 4 women? Another truth that I want to elevate is that education expands opportunity. That is something else that is elevated in their stories that we have to make sure that we never forget, because this truth is also still alive today. Third truth, education builds community. And that's a very exciting truth for me during a time in the world where it feels like our communities are very disjointed, we're very separated, we're very enraged. This is a truth that we have to remember is necessary for us to hold on to if we want to continue to move forward as a society, honestly. We have to remember that education does build community. And then the fourth truth that these 4 ladies helped us to think about tonight is that education shapes leadership and representation. And these are 4 truths. We could probably keep unpacking even more. But as I continue discussing tonight, I hope that you'll begin to see more how these truths can be illuminated with these 4 women's stories and how they still apply today. There was one morning when I was getting my youngest baby, who's not a baby, Maya, ready for school. And she's so smart. And I'm not just saying that because I'm her mom. Jericho, would you agree? Like, she's really smart, right? And he's not just saying that because he's her dad. Like, she's really, really smart. But she really does not like to go to school. She would really rather just be in her little apartment, which is her bedroom. She calls it her apartment. She would really just rather be there. And like, I get it, baby, but we have to go to school. And one day we were getting ready for school, and she said, oh my goodness, like, why do we even have to do this? I said, do what? She said, go to school. Why can't we, like, who thought of this? And I said, well, honey, look, school has been a thing in Knoxville since the 1700s. And she said the 1700s, like, yes, it's really been a thing since the 1700s. So, in fact, what many of our young people do not realize, actually Knoxville opened its first academy in 1793. And that feels like so long ago. And to think of how far we've come and how much has changed, and even thinking about what was happening in the nation that we had at that time, it's amazing to imagine that there was school going on. Like there was actually school happening around 1793. By 1871, so almost 100, about 80 years later, residents voted to establish the first public school system. And at that point, that meant that there were a few schools that were renting out buildings across the city, but they were beginning to work together. It wasn't just sitting in mom's kitchen learning math and reading. It was, you know, we're actually moving together as a system. That happened in the 1870s. And so that was something that really was beginning to take shape in the background of all the other things that were happening in our world. Education was moving and becoming a system. Much like much of early American education, though, as you see in these pictures, it's very much one-dimensional. We don't see very much variation across the ethnicities of the children in those pictures. We were in a time where, not surprisingly, school was built for white males first. Then, eventually, white girls were allowed to go to school too. But then even still further down the line was it before black children were allowed to attend school. And even then, black males first, and then black females. So even though black children were excluded entirely or forced to rely on informal teaching in homes and schools, there was still this fervor around education. It was still something that was very much important. And at this time, it wasn't whether children were going to be allowed to, or whether or not we were going to be able to improve schools or not. Families were wondering, well, is my child even going to be allowed to attend a school? That was the question that some families were having. In the 1790s, when the male children were able to go to school, parents and moms were thinking, well, is my girl ever going to get a chance to go to school? Is this only going to always be for males? That was something that was always a conversation, not loud, but it was a conversation that was always happening. So thinking about all of that and bringing us back to Knoxville Central, it really helps us to have that little bit of understanding first before we really dive into the role that women played in shaping education in Knoxville. And if we really want to think about, where did this begin here, it's really those years around or just after the Civil War. And at this point, across the South, during this period, newly freed black communities were building schools wherever they could. And there were very few resources, but there was extraordinary commitment to learning. So let's look at the first truth, because this is going to bring up our first woman that we're highlighting tonight. Historians of education often point out that the earliest schools serving black communities in the South were not created by formal institutions, but by individuals within those communities. So it usually was someone who stepped forward and said, I'm going to allow, or I'm going to ask, or I'm going to create. That's how education began in black communities. And in Knoxville, the first steps toward formal education not only was going to end up serving black students, but it was going to serve all students well. And it began with a woman, a moment of courage, and a classroom. And when we look at those earliest efforts to educate black children in Knoxville, one truth does become clear, that education began as an act of freedom. And the woman that embodies that is Laura Ann Scott Canceller. She was born in the mid-1840s. Some records say 1844, some say 1846. But she was actually not a native of Tennessee. She was born in western North Carolina. And she was born free at the time, when freedom for black families was fragile, it was very uncertain, and it was almost unheard of, right? There was a time when she was about 6 years old, when her family said, hey, let's just pack up and leave North Carolina. We want to make sure our kids have a better opportunity than we had. And we've heard that in Ohio, there's equal opportunity for all children to learn. So her family decided to pack up when she was about 6 and head towards Ohio. And their hope was simple. They just wanted to make sure their children had an opportunity to learn and receive an education like other children did. But they didn't make it to Ohio. Instead, they settled in Friendsville in Blount County, which is right outside of Knoxville. So they settled right around the corner from us. And from an early age, Laura was an avid reader. It's recorded that she was taught by her parents and by Reverend Thomas William Humes. So we know we've heard the Humes name before, right? A Presbyterian minister here in Knoxville. He was a strong unionist, and he believed that all children, which included Black children, all children deserved an opportunity to learn, and that education should be available for all. So those early lessons from the people around Laura, that planted a seed in her, and that seed would grow into something remarkable. As a young woman, she married Hugh Lawson Chancellor, and he was a skilled wheelwright who was also from a free Black family in East Tennessee. Let's raise our hands if we've heard of the name Chancellor. Okay, so Chancellor is a pretty big name here in Knoxville. You've heard it even if you didn't realize you heard it, because it just kind of runs together when we talk about the Chancellor YMCA, right? It just runs right in together. That name is from this family. It's from Laura Chancellor and her husband, Hugh Lawson. They were very connected to a lot of the contributions that are still standing here in East Tennessee. They would go on to do a lot of work in education. Their children even became educators. One of their children, one of their sons, opened up a library here in Knoxville. So their family ended up starting so many things that are still standing here today in 2026, way back in the late 1800s. But long before the family name appeared on buildings, Laura Chancellor was already shaping Knoxville's history in a much quieter way. And that moment came around the Civil War. So East Tennessee, we know this, during the Civil War, it was a wild place to be, right? The Confederate forces controlled much of the region. Safety for all families, not just families of color, not just families of color. All families were nervous during that time. It was war in East Tennessee, in their backyard, in their homes. But in September of 1863, something significant happened. Does anyone in the room happen to know what might have happened around September 1863 in Tennessee? What might have happened? Oh, somebody knows. You know, but you don't want to share. Are you nervous? I'm a great teacher. I promise I never make any of my students feel bad if they get an answer wrong. It's okay. We got it? Have we heard of the 8th of August? What happened during the 8th of August?
Life for free. And they could go to the
They could go to the Channel Park, okay? So around that same time, a little bit after, something else happened, and that's when Laura Chancellor approached General Ambrose Burnside. So Burnside had captured Knoxville and had created a whole shift of power. So went from being heavily Confederate to Union, all right? Burnside was a heavy Unionist, and he favored so much in making sure that everyone had the opportunities afforded to them as being human beings, right? Not based on color. So what Laura Scott Chancellor did, she decided, okay, I know that he cares a little bit more about education than other people have, so let me go see if I can just try my hand at something. Laura Chancellor asked General Burnside, would it be okay if we started a small school for Black children to be able to learn to read and write? So since now, we've shifted the powers and the emancipation is coming and things have happened, can we now start doing that more for Black children? And he gave her permission to do that. One woman, courage, hope. She asked for that and it was granted to her. And so that school would go on to be called Burnside School, and it was located on Detroit Avenue. Detroit Avenue does not exist today. I don't believe there's one in Knoxville. If it is, it's not in the place where Burnside School is. But Detroit Avenue at that time, where Burnside School is located, is where modern-day University of Tennessee is located. So there was a shift at a point in time where urban renewal was occurring, and that was the major overhaul, government overhaul of renewing the area, but it removed a lot of Black families from the area that they lived for decades, for generations with their families. And so when that, at that time, when that happened, Burnside School also left with it. But it was located where it's present-day University of Tennessee. Burnside School was decided to be the first official school for Black children to be able to learn to read and write. That also made Laura Kanzler Knoxville's first Black school teacher. And not only did she teach children to read and write during that time, but she also taught adults who were newly freed, who had never been given the opportunity to read and write. Now, to fully understand the significance of that moment, I'm going to read an excerpt from my book because I actually talk about this in here. Generations, imagine that for generations, learning was not just something that was discouraged for enslaved persons. It was literally criminalized. It was literally criminalized. And the reason was simple, and that's because literacy brought power. So I want to read something so that you can see just how significant it is that Laura Kanzler stepped out on faith, hope, and courage and said, I'm going to ask General Burnside if we can have a school here for Black children. So this excerpt is from my book, chapter 2. And I wrote this chapter, it's all about the history of education in our country because I wanted to make a point clear, which is that Black girls have not always been thought of as part of the educational experience. Education was not created, public education was not created with all students in mind at first. At first it was just for, fill in the blank, who do you think it was for at first? For males, white males, yeah. So it's natural for us to need to go back and examine some of that for us to understand the experiences that our students have. So this is the excerpt that I want to share. And actually, I sure did. There we go, so if you want to follow along. Other slave owners feared that information sharing would lead to more slave rebellions. Slave revolts such as the 1739 Stono Rebellion and the 1831 Nat Turner Revolt made anti-literacy an urgent implementation for systemic control of enslaved persons. White slave owners felt that Black persons with the ability to read and write could use their skills to create an imbalance in the power structure between master and slave. Learning to read and write revealed hope beyond the inhumanity enslaved persons were forced to experience. Literacy meant freedom, intellectual freedom, until physical freedom could be realized. Black literacy was a revolutionizing weapon and the ultimate tool for enslaved persons to build, organize, and push toward freedom. So in thinking about Laura Kanzler's bold move to go to General Burnside and ask for this opportunity, it really takes on an entirely different meaning when we know that that's the landscape that she was in at the time. Because her school represented something that many people before her had only been able to pursue in secret. Learning out in the open, education without fear, opportunity without punishment. And again, her classroom was not just for children, but it was also for formerly enslaved adults. When I was doing research for my book, I learned something that I didn't know, which was that one way that Black women were so critical in trying to create some type of education even while enslaved, one thing that they did is if they happened to be working near the house as opposed to working in the field, they would sneak the newspaper from the home and take it back out to the enslaved living quarters and would sneak it back to everyone else so they could try to make sense of the newspaper. That's what they did. That's the type of perils that they faced. So the fact that Laura Kanzler said, I'm going to teach not only children, but also the formerly enslaved how to read, that was certainly revolutionary. I mean, imagine that room, right? If you imagine, I don't know if you've ever sat with a young child before and watched how they take their time trying to sound out a word and trying to put the letters together and trying to make sense of the sounds and the vowels and the consonants. That is a feeling. Once you hear them say that word, that is a feeling that you can't explain that really. How good it feels to hear a person learn to read for the first time. And that was the experience that she was setting up for all people during that time. So Laura would continue her work as an educator for many years after this. Education became a legacy within her family, And again, as I mentioned, several of her children went on to become educators as well. And then in 1952, Knoxville honored her legacy by naming Chancellor Elementary School in her memory. Does anyone remember Chancellor Elementary School? Okay, because again, I'm not from Knoxville, so I would not know, right? Okay. So please share that, Ms. Campbell. I'm sorry. Please go ahead and share that.
My mother, it was in Mechanicsville,
Yes.
kind of on top of, as you go over the hill, as you go over to MLB building, it's that kind of up there.
Yes.
And we're visually going to this now.
Yes.
That's what it is.
Yes.
But my mother, I didn't go there, but my mother went there. They grew up in that area.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And I know it looks like I just picked on this beautiful woman sitting in this room. This is my, let's see, she's my mentor now. She's a beautiful friend of mine, and she's also my former principal from 3 years ago when I was an administrator at Austin East. So we actually have some legacies sitting in this room, but I won't turn the attention on them unless they will let me turn the attention. Okay, I won't. I'll say that for another chat. So Chancellor Elementary School is no longer here anymore. It went on to become a Boys and Girls Club, also Wesley House. Yes. So I was trying to find a beautiful picture that really brought honor to the Wesley House Community Center, but I decided to show this one because when you see that, you know who it is. You know when you see the little bird, you know what that is. But that is the legacy of Laura Chancellor. That is how it continues to live on. And this is why I say that education, one truth that we can see from this story, is that education began as an act of freedom. So there's another story that I'm going to share with you now. We're going to shift and we're kind of moving up the timeline now, right? So we started with Laura Chancellor. We're going to kind of move on up the timeline, and we're going to hit around the Reconstruction era at this point. So we've moved from Civil War, post-Civil War, just a little bit after. Now we're in the Reconstruction era. Classrooms were beginning to take root. The next question became, well, how far can education go? So now we're thinking about how education expands opportunity. During the Reconstruction era, communities across the South were beginning to expand the educational opportunities beyond basic literacy, and they were moving towards secondary schooling. So we were getting away from just elementary school to now we're pushing towards, okay, well, the kids are learning some things. Let's keep on moving them forward. Let's see how far we can get them. And the question now came up as well, like, can Black students in Knoxville have access to more than basic literacy? Can they pursue higher learning? And once it began to take root, another truth emerged about expanding opportunity. That truth is reflected in the work of Emily Austin. So after the Civil War ended around 1865, we now have thousands upon hundreds of thousands of newly freed Black families across the South, and they were seeking something that had long been denied to them, which was education. Northern educators, many of them women, began traveling to the South to help establish schools. They were already schooling their children, all of their children, right? Remember, Laura Chancellor's family, they were on their way to Ohio to create an opportunity for their children, right? So Emily Austin was one of those educators. She was an abolitionist. She was born in Philadelphia around 1830. She was deeply connected to that movement. And she arrived in Knoxville in 1870 with one mission, and that was to provide educational opportunities to all children, Black children included. At that time, many students were still being taught in church basements, lodge halls, small one-room schools like the Burnside School where Chancellor was, all scattered across the city. So for 8 years, Emily Austin taught in all of these different schools, and she focused on the ones that served Black students, and namely the Cresswell School. And as a side note, something I learned from my research that I did not know prior to this, is that the Cresswell School later merged with McKee School of Nashville, which is the foundation of how Knoxville College became Knoxville College. So it's not that Emily founded Knoxville College, but she was in the beginning of those conversations because she was over the Cresswell School, closed that school so that it could merge with McKee, and those two schools came together to help found Knoxville College. She realized something quickly while she was working in Cresswell School, which was that, because at the time Cresswell School was mostly elementary age, And she realized elementary education would not carry the educational journey forward for Black students, that we needed to do more than giving them just the basics of things. And at that time, even though the abolitionists were moving and making things happen, many of the schools kind of stopped at elementary. So in elementary age, we're talking 5th, 6th grade, maybe 7th grade. So if we think back, I can even remember talking to my mother, talking with my mom about how her grandparents had a 6th or 7th grade education. So that was something that was common in the Black community during that time. So Emily Austin coming and saying, well, let's talk about expanding it further. That's revolutionizing. That was bold. That was courageous. She was walking on hope, but she was walking forward boldly. So what she did is she returned to the North. She began raising money. She actually raised what's reported is $6,500 during the 1800s. That was a lot of money. I mean, it's a lot of money now. I wouldn't mind $6,500. So it was definitely a lot of money then, right? And then the Knoxville, because there was at that time there was now beginning to form a board, right? There was now people who were forming a system around education in Knoxville. They matched that and gave her $2,000. And that is what created Knoxville's first Black high school, which was Austin High School, opening its doors. I wonder if anyone in this room knows what year the doors opened. Austin High School. Yeah, what? Oh, look further. But you're close. She said 71?
75.
No. 79. 1879. Y'all were close. So the school became a cornerstone in the community, not just in the Black community, but in the community, because it was a school that was built literally from a woman who said, we can do better than this. We can do better than mediocre for students. The legacy of Austin High School is amazing. That could be its own lecture. That could be a series of lectures, honestly. I could not do it justice to talk through the whole legacy of Austin High School, but to sum it up, I will say that Austin High School, it continued as Austin Junior High. It later transitioned to what we know now as Vine Middle Magnet School. Vine Middle Magnet School is extremely personal for me. That picture I shared at the beginning of the slideshow, that was at Vine Middle Magnet School. When I started at Vine Middle School, I had no idea about the legacy and the history that was there. I knew it was something because I could feel it in the hallways. I'm telling you, you could walk through the building, you could feel the strength and the power. You could tell that you were walking in the halls where greatness has been. But I didn't know the full story. I began to learn it as the years continued on. I learned a lot about the history of Vine Middle School at the Beck Cultural Center, which is where my then principal made sure that we went to learn the history of where our students' families come from. But walking in the building in Vine Middle School, knowing that I taught there and that I helped to create experiences for students that would help them grow into the humans that we knew they could be, knowing that that started with Emily Austin's legacy is something that I can barely bring words to be very honest with you. It is absolutely beautiful. And to see that her legacy continues to shape the classrooms, that's why I say that her legacy, her story reveals an important truth, which is that education expands opportunity. And I would be remiss if I did not say, I have two principals in the room here, and I did not know they were coming, but two of my principals are in the room. So I had one principal while I was an administrator at Austin East, and I have another principal while I was a science teacher at Vine Middle School, and she is sitting here today. And my heart is just so happy to see that they're both here. But to talk about Emily Austin is definitely to talk about a woman who experienced courage, and she had a zeal that no one was going to stop her. She raised thousands of dollars to open a school, and she was not even native of Knoxville, and she came here to do that. And the school and the legacy is still here today. So that is something that is absolutely beautiful. Moving on forward in our time now, we're going to come up a little higher now. And this brings us to the next truth, the third one that I mentioned, which is that education builds community. As Knoxville continued to grow in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries, education was also beginning to evolve as well. So during this period in the U.S., the public education systems were really beginning to be established and to take form. They were growing rapidly too. They were growing rapidly. To be educated was the #1 priority of all people during this time. Oh, I just wish that was the case today, but we're working on it, y'all. Pray for the educators. To be educated was the #1 priority during this time, right? And what was beautiful is that women increasingly became the backbone of the teaching profession. And some may wonder why. Like, why is it that women became the backbone of the teaching profession? Is there anyone who might want to take a hand at answering why women might have been of the backbone of the teaching profession during this time? Yes, the men were going to war. Yeah, the men were going to war. They were either going or coming or preparing for one. That was pretty much what was happening during this time in our nation, right? And what I would like to think, and to your point, is that that might be why the pay became what it was. It's like the chicken or the egg, which one came first? I think that might have been why. Yeah, but we're working on it. We're working. This Women's History Month. We're gonna keep raising our voices about that equal pay. Need to be what it is. But it is a beautiful thing though that women were becoming the backbone, because again, this was giving opportunity for women to build communities. So in the years after the Civil War, I mentioned that Knoxville had established its first public school system around 1870s. Free public schools. The first classes opened that same year, and they were renting buildings all across the city. Around 1874 is when Knoxville built its first dedicated public school building. So there were schools around. They might have been one-room schools, or they might have been in a basement or at a church. But in 1874 was the first public school building that was built. And that was that marked an important shift in that time, because now we were beginning to see that education was no longer just the work of individual people, but it was the work of a community. That is something we need to remember today, is that it's not just the individual people that make education what it is. It's not just the teachers that support education in the classrooms. It's the entire community. You don't have to have a child in school to care about what's happening with the schools, right? So that was the shift that was happening during this time. One of those women that played a major role in helping to create that shift in seeing education as a community is Belle Morris. She was born in, it should be 1869, there we go. And this was just as Knoxville was growing into a more established city. She came of age during a time when education opportunities for women were still limited, but teaching had begun to emerge as one of the few professions that women could take as their path to career. They helped to shape the moral and civic character of their communities. I tried to find it, but I couldn't. It was one day I was just randomly scrolling on social media. I consider that my professional learning when I'm scrolling. I say it is, even if it's not. But I really did find something really interesting, and I can't find it today, but there's that. I found an image of, it was a contract that teachers had to sign. And that contract, it had things like, you must make sure you show up for work at a certain time. You must wear your skirts below your knees, no more than 2 inches above the ankle, yada, yada. You may not chew gum. You may not drink in public. If you see a male walking one way, you must not stare at them in the eyes. It was just all this outrageous stuff. And that was the contract that the teachers had to sign at the time. That's the time when Belle Morris enters the chat, okay? She's coming in around this time, and it was a time, so it wasn't just about, delivering lessons in math and science and reading. It was also about moral and civic character. So to be a teacher meant that you were an example in your community. You were remarkable. You were a tall, standing citizen, and everyone expected you to always carry yourself as such. She was expected to model discipline, integrity, and leadership. So to find individuals like her was not uncommon to find a woman in the classroom during this time that was modeling discipline, integrity, and confidence and leadership. At this time, educators were also beginning to work very closely with families and with neighborhoods. Often they knew their students' siblings, the parents. They understood the broader lives of the children that they taught, much like today. Belle Morris became known as one of the educators who helped strengthen Knoxville's growing public school system during the late 19th and early 20th century. And her work reflected a larger national movement in which women educators were becoming the leaders in public education. So it wasn't just, I'm the teacher in the room, but I am leading the educational experience for the students that I impact and the community as they see it as well. After her death in 1932, the city chose to honor her legacy in a meaningful way. Belle Morris Elementary School opened and was named in her honor. And the school was built in North Knoxville, where it still is, serving families in that residential neighborhood. And at the time, North Knoxville was a rapidly developing area. There were lots of families, small businesses, churches, new homes. So schools like Belle Morris quickly became anchors for those neighborhoods. Children walked to school together. Teachers knew families by name. School events brought neighbors together. And in many ways, the school became more than a building. It became the hub for community fellowship. And it was a gathering place. It was a place where family life, neighborhood identity, all of that stuff came together at once. And Belle Morris helped to create that before the school was ever even built. Her name being associated not just with teaching, but with the idea that schools are places where communities invest in the future, that tells us a lot about her legacy. And that's why I say that one truth that her story elevates is that education builds communities. Because we know that schools are not just places where students are learning to read and write, but they're places where neighborhoods gather, they're places where relationships form, lifelong relationships form there, and they're places where the next generation begins to imagine its future. So now that we've looked at our three women, we're gonna move into our final champion. And this champion helps us to see that education shapes leadership and representation. So now we're in the mid-20th century, and it's unfolding. Education in Knoxville is continuing to evolve. Schools have been established. Communities have grown around the schools. Public education has become a movement within the structure of the city. It's something that we talk about. It's an important issue. It's something that we argue about even. So that's happening at this point. But also what has happened at this point that we're going to jump into the story, the civil rights movement has challenged segregation. And it's reshaping educational systems as the United States ever knew it. And so at this point, an important question is beginning to emerge. Who helps to shape the decisions that guide all of these schools that now are functioning as a system? Who helps to shape those decisions? Who would help determine the policies, the procedures, the opportunities that would affect thousands of students for generations after? And that leads us to our fourth woman of the night, and that is Sarah Moore Green. Miss Sarah Moore Green. Miss Sarah Moore Green was born in 1910 during a time when the American South was still deeply segregated. She attended a segregated school, and these schools that existed had black and white students separate. Rarely were the resources equal. Rarely were the facilities the same. So that means rarely were the opportunities the same. Despite all those barriers though, black educators across the South continued doing something remarkable. And they built strong schools. They mentored generations of students, and they held firmly to the belief that education was the pathway to progress. And Sarah Moore Green was one of those educators. She devoted her life to supporting students and strengthening educational opportunities within Knoxville's black community, but her leadership extended beyond the classroom. And before we talk about the significance of her leadership, I want to again remind you of something broader about the educational landscape that black women were navigating during the time. In my book, I explore how even after black students gained access to public education following the Civil War, black women and girls often faced additional barriers shaped by both race and gender. So I'm going to read a quick excerpt about that. Even beyond the unequal access to quality education for Black persons was the unequal access for female students. Once widespread access to public school was gained for both Black girls and Black boys in the mid-19th century, following the end of slavery and the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, Black children were generally allowed access to education, generally. However, girls were sometimes taught a completely different curriculum and had limited access to higher education. Additionally, social constructs and norms about women's place in society pushed the importance of education for Black girls to the background. Although Black women and men were philosophically committed to education, entrenched gender roles imposed by society often relegated women to domestic responsibilities, making it harder for them to access education in the same way as men. So when we understand that history, the leadership of someone like Sarah Moore Green becomes even more significant, because she was navigating not just racial barriers, but gender barriers as well at the same time, and yet she persisted. Because remember, she was looking at who's gonna lead during this time, who's gonna help form the policies that are the backbones of this educational system. But she went on to become a respected educator and a community leader in Knoxville, known for her commitment to students and families. And in 1970, Sarah Moore Green made history. She became the first Black woman appointed to the Knox County School Board. And that moment mattered, because school boards made decisions, and still do, that affect thousands of students. They shape policies, they oversee budgets, they influence the direction of entire school systems, the curriculum, the testing, the leaders who lead in the schools. And for generations, those decisions had often been made without any Black voices fully represented at the table. So now, as a Black woman educator, someone who understood the realities of those classrooms and communities, she was helping to guide the future of education in Knoxville. Her leadership represented something powerful. It showed that the work begun by earlier educators, women like Laura Scott Kanzler, Emily Austin, had grown into something larger, and that education had moved from classrooms to institutions, now to leadership. And Sarah Moore Green lived a long life of service and leadership. She passed at 102 years old. And that legacy is still visible in a place that is very special to me, because today I serve as an assistant principal at Sarah Moore Green Magnet Academy. And that school carries her name, her legacy, her spirit. Every day students walk through the halls. I'm gonna throw a picture up there. Every day students walk through the halls, and there's a large mural on the wall. And I promise it looks like Sarah Moore Green is looking at you. And every time I see the kids, I'm like, surely you're not gonna continue to make those decisions when this Sarah Moore Green is like right there. Like, what do we think that? But she is definitely someone that we are proud to have a school named after. Just recently, our school community celebrated her birthday during our Arts and Humanities Night. So we were able to kind of put it all together. It was Black History Month celebration, her birthday's in February, also Arts and Humanities celebration, and we were able to bring all of that together. Students performed. These are Bond Middle School students who performed a piece dedicated to her. Families gathered, teachers shared their work, and we honored the legacy of the woman whose name our school is named, whose school our school is named after. And here's some Sarah Moore Green students performing a little piece that they also dedicated to her. Moments like that remind me that history is not something distant. It's something we continue building every single day. And that's why Sarah Moore Green's story reveals our fourth truth about education, that education shapes leadership and representation. It does not just prepare students for the future, but it really prepares leaders who will guide communities. I think about my students who have since graduated and are now adults and living in the world, and I see them and I'm thinking, you are truly guiding our community at this point. You are helping to shape who our society will become 10, 15, 30, 50 years from now, right? So as we think about all of these women, and I'm preparing to close now, I want us to remember that these women, that this work that these women have done, it is continuing to unfold. Across more than a century, education in Knoxville has moved from freedom to opportunity, to community, to leadership. Every day across Knoxville, teachers are doing the same quiet work that these women once did, encouraging students, opening doors, expanding possibilities, being examples, being a model for them, right? Even in our imperfection, we are always trying to stand up and show our students who they can be. And as a mother of two daughters, I think about this often. I think about the teachers who will shape their confidence, the classrooms that will either affirm their potential or challenge them to find their voice. And education is never neutral. It either opens a door or it closes them. There's really not an in-between. And the women that we've talked about tonight spent their lives making sure more doors open. This is a topic that I was so excited to talk about with everyone. And there were a few other women that we won't have time to dive into, but as I was doing my research, I ran across their information and it was just really palpable to me. Rhonda E. Mason and Mabel Mason Wells, they were also two educators that were very prolific in the community and helping to shape education in Knoxville. Members of the Mason family, a patriarch, James Mason, he actually founded Tennessee's first school for the deaf for Black children in Knoxville in 1879. They also played an important role in expanding educational opportunity, also with a group of people that others might have written off and forgotten about. And they stood tall and taught the students that were in their classrooms. But thinking about not just those two beautiful women, but also the four women that we've looked at tonight, it reminds us that though they had different lives, they lived during different circumstances. They were actually, we have two Black women on either end, and Belle Morris and Emily Austin were white women. They shared the same belief in something powerful, which is that education could create a better future. Cities are not just held together only by laws and institutions. They're held together by the people who believe in the next generation. The teachers, the mothers, the mentors, the community leaders, other women, often working quietly, often without recognition, but always leaving behind something powerful, which is hope. And if Knoxville has lasted more than 250 years, it's not only because of the leaders whose names appear in history books and on buildings, it's because of the educators who quietly shaped generations of minds, and many of them were women. Thank you all so much. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
We appreciate it. Does anybody have questions for Dr. Hawkins?
Yes.
How were the schools funded through the years?
Through the years, from what I saw, it really, because many of the schools happened within their own individual places, they were funded by whomever organized it. So if I were the one that said, I'm going to pull all the neighborhood kids who are within close quarters and we're going to learn math, then I would take care of funding it. But when we think about school funding in that sense, it wasn't the way we look at it now. It was maybe I just need chalk and a board, and that's really it. The teachers in individual school homes or school houses or in basements or in churches, they cleaned them themselves. They organized the materials. They found the desks. They gathered the children. They opened the doors. They closed the doors. They made the sandwiches if the students wanted to eat there, or they would send them home to eat. So when we think about school funding compared to now, it's very, very different. When we move to more of a public school system, then that's where the taxes came in. So our tax dollars were even then still being used to help fund the schools at that time, which was why it was so important to make sure we had everyone's voices at the table so that money allocations, budget conversations, all of those things were being talked about in an equitable way. Any other questions? Yes.
Were there female academies after the Civil War for African American girls in Knoxville?
I'm not sure if in Knoxville, if you hadn't said Knoxville, I was going to be, yes, there were. I'm not sure about Knoxville, but there were female academies, female schools just for Black girls. Many of those schools would eventually become the colleges that we know of now, the historical Black colleges and universities. Mary Bethune-McLeod, her college was one that was just for Black girls. We have Spelman College that was just for Black girls. Many of them were on the higher post-secondary world, but there were some. In Knoxville specifically, I'm not sure. I did not come across that, but now I need to go back and see if I can find it.
You've brought so many questions in my mind, going back and when I grew up and how, I'm old, but not quite that old. And, my town was a very small town in southern Illinois, and all the Black children went to the grade school, one grade school. And I always felt I just couldn't understand it, that our high school was
integrated?
Yeah, back then. So it was a time when they started out, did they have to be afraid that they had to hide and everything? Yes. I mean, was this all?
Yes. Are you talking before school? They were allowed to go to school?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. If we're thinking about during the time of slavery, they were absolutely hiding. There were some gruesome things that would happen if an enslaved person was caught trying to learn to read.
How did they learn? How did the ones learn to learn so they could teach?
Yes.
Where did that start?
So most times they would listen to, or they would, as they were maybe, if they were working in the house, as they were serving breakfast or serving food, if someone was sitting at the dinner table or at the kitchen table and they were talking, they would kind of peer over their shoulder and try to make sense of what they were reading. They would listen to the conversations. And that's why I included that in my book, is for people to realize how incredibly intelligent a person has to be to learn from nothing, to not be formally taught how to assemble the letters in the alphabet to create a word, and yet to still be able to do that. That makes the case of the fact it actually trumps the argument that, some people, everyone's not created to learn the same. No, we are all brilliant and beautiful, no matter what our skin tone might be, no matter how much melanin we have, no matter how much the sun has shined on us today. We have all the capability to learn and achieve intelligence in that way. So that's something why I even put that in my book. But yes, that's what they did. They would have to peer over the shoulders. They would take stories from others. Now there were some people that actually did teach. And I wonder, maybe they kind of felt sorry for the enslaved persons. I don't know, but they taught some of the Black people that lived in their areas how to read. They would teach them how. But as soon as revolt started happening, that's when it stopped. Because they didn't want them, like, oh no, they're coming together. They banned things called mental meetings, is what they called them. A mental meeting meant if you saw a group of enslaved persons together, that means that they're up to something. That's banned.
Well, now they're taking books out of.
Oh yeah.
So,
see how history is.
Oh, wait a minute. You put too many questions in my mind.
Well, that's good. We keep asking.
I'm a retired teacher, so it's interesting.
Oh, well then you're bound to question forever. Then you're a retired teacher. You're never gonna stop. You're never gonna stop. My mom is a retired teacher. I know, retired.
Well, I'd like to put a little 2 cents in. I do know, I lived in New Orleans for a few years, that the Ursuline convent intentionally taught women of color outside the law, intentionally, and they had no shame in doing it, and they were going to make sure that everybody had an education and opportunity. So I think from those types of urban centers where the nuns were, it would just spill out into the southeast and stuff like that, because these were people who were obviously enslaved, and they made sure they knew how to read.
Yes.
But they were protected first.
The nuns were, but the education spills out, and so if you're enslaved and you were sold somewhere else, it goes on.
How much is your book?
Oh, well, that's a great question. Let me talk about that. So,
I saw some copies.
Yeah. Okay, here's the story. You ready for it? I I learned that I don't get any special treatment as an author with my publisher. So I called to order more copies of the book, and it got slowed down, so they did not come. So I have 3 copies here with me today, and I would love to actually give them away. I don't want to sell them today, but I do have another mechanism for purchasing the book. It is $37.95 without tax, and there's a couple different ways you can order. You can go, if you scan this QR code, and I also have the code set up over here on the round table. These QR codes will take you to the 2 places where you can purchase the book. Corwin is my publisher. It's available on their website. If you order from them, there is a code where you can get 20% off, and I would love for you to take advantage of that. You can also order it on Amazon because it's Amazon, okay? So that code is there too. I believe that they're the same price at both places. I double checked that because I didn't want to, have that mess up. But if you would like signed copies, I do have a QR code for that. So you would just scan that code. It will take you to a Google form to give me your name, your mailing address, and what you would like your personalized note to be, and I will be glad to put that in there. That was my plan for today, and I had to quickly pivot. So the pivot is the QR code there, and then I will actually send you a personalized copy of the book. But yes, they are $37.95 without tax. If you decide that you would like a signed copy, then I already included the tax and the price when you see that when you go to the website to be able to purchase it. But the 3 copies I'd like to give away today, okay. I'm trying to decide if I want to do a trivia. No, I won't make it too hard. Actually, yes, I forgot you're supposed to do that part. Thank you, Jessica. Okay, thank you so much. He came right up because he knew I was going to forget. So I would love for someone to maybe just share what else resonated with you about this chat tonight.
Just that I didn't know about 3 of the 4 that you presented.
Okay.
So, I mean, not maybe heard the names, but never knew anything. That's been helpful.
Who did you know? What name did you know?
Well, of course,
Sarah McGreen, yes.
Yeah, but and Chancellor perhaps.
Yes. Wonderful.
But I would love to buy a book for the Walton.
Oh, yes, we can absolutely do that. Thank you. Thank you so much. I would love to do that.
Leave it